All right, good morning. I don't know if Pastor should have told you that I'll be speaking all month because maybe you'll take the rest of the month off. But that's all right. All right. Well, yes. So, like Pastor said, we'll be spending all month together. And what we'll be doing is just continuing the series that I started at the beginning of the year on the excellence of the law. So, continuing to build on this idea that Pastor started the year off of a spirit of excellence. And so we've been looking at the Old Testament law, specifically how it allows us to understand, to act, and to live in an excellent manner in this day and age. And so for those who may have missed, and you can go back on and get the other videos on Facebook if you're ever curious, but January went over an overview of the law and the lessons it speaks. February, we went into the presence of God, how the presence of God is what demanded the law itself. To be close to God, the people of Israel had to live differently, excellently. In March, we moved into the offerings. Some of them we'll look at more later this year. And then in April, we looked at the tabernacle. So that was one lesson per month. And so then we're going to have 4 here in the month of May. And I won't give them all away yet, but we will continue to move through this week. But this week is one about which I was most nervous in the whole series. And so I ask that you pray for me as we look today, because today we will look at, as God originally moved specifically to begin giving the Old Testament law in its setting, we have a record we'll look at here in a few minutes where he came down and he himself verbally spoke to the nation to deliver part of the law. Now, much of what we read in Leviticus and Numbers of the law that we'll get into in coming weeks and months was given to Moses in conversation together. But at the outset, God gave some of the law verbally to the people himself. He actually spoke with his voice to the whole nation. And it is that section about which we want to look today. And so it is most humbling to speak on a set of words that God verbally spoke to this world, to try to, it's all the Word of God, but just to imagine that very few times did he speak verbally to a group of people, and this was one of those times. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Exodus 19 and 20, if you can guess where we are going as you do that, and I'll open us in a word of prayer as we open the Word together. Father, we just thank you for speaking, for inserting yourself into human history in such a way that you communicated your law, your love, and yourself to us as humans and as people created in your image. As we look at a passage today, may we be humble learners. May your Spirit guide our hearts and our minds that we may think carefully. And Father, may we be sparked both to live with purpose, but also to continue to be students of your word and continue to grow and to learn and always be ready to change both our thoughts and our actions to be more like you and more in tune with that which you have communicated. Bless this time together, and may we grow as a body and as individuals today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, if you are there in Exodus 19 and 20, you are aware that we are looking at something that has traditionally been called the 10 what? The 10 Commandments. But right out of the gate, they weren't, not always have they been called the 10 Commandments. In fact, for many years, they carried the name the Decalogue. And if you are a student of etymology, any etymology fans here? Not a whole lot of hands. Okay, that's good. etymology, study of where words came from and things of that nature. Very fascinating to weird people like myself. But anyway, Decalogue, deca means 10. Log comes from the word logos for word. And so for a long time, these were really known as the 10 words. And part of that comes from Exodus 20, verse 1, where it said, God spoke all these words, saying. And then there was the set of 10. So for a long time, this was known to many people as the 10 words. Now, yes, they are indeed commandments, so I'm not trying to tell you that's wrong. But it's really fascinating to think of Jewish people, even some to this day, won't call them the 10 Commandments. They'll call them the 10 words. And it's important to kind of get that idea, because we have to remember over and over again that the law and so much of what God spoke, as we've been looking as we go through the law, isn't necessarily just the aspect of restrictiveness. It is the idea of God's communication. Now, there are restrictions in God's communication, but God's focus was always to communicate and to have relationship. And that's why I often bring up the fact that in the garden, in Eden, what was the first rule or communication that God gave people? And so often we think, what? Don't eat from the tree in the middle of the garden, right? But in fact, the first spoken direction that God gave was, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and have dominion. See, God's initial communication was instruction in a positive light to care for the world, and then he started to add restrictions. And that is the case. We often go so caught up in restrictions. Even when Satan came to Eve, what did God say? Well, he said, don't eat from this tree or touch it lest you die, right? We continue to add clarifiers and restrictions and exceptions for various reasons. But here in Exodus 20, verse 1, God spoke these words. The Bible is always careful with the words it chooses, and it doesn't say God spoke these commandments. Now, if God speaks, it is indeed a burden that we are to bear and to carry out. But I like that the Bible shares that as that idea. So let us think for a minute, though, about the setting these came from, because we actually get this list 2 times, one here in Exodus 20 and one in Deuteronomy 5, and we're going to look at both of them together. But the setting is very unique for when God gave these. So we have to do that here in Exodus 19. We have to go back one chapter and reflect on where we are. So here is this nation, and the first 19 chapters is a chronological story of how the people got from one place to a place where God was going to speak to them. So we find out in Exodus 1 that a Pharaoh arose who didn't know Joseph. He began to be afraid, and he oppressed the people. Moses is born. God speaks to Moses out of a bush and sends him on this message. Then we have 10 plagues, and really the book of Exodus is 3 sets of 10. If you ever want to study it, there's 10 plagues, there's 10 words or commandments, and then there's 10 items in the tabernacle. That's just a general outline of Exodus for you. So we have these 10 plagues. God delivers them. They cross the Red Sea. After they move across the Red Sea, they are into what is called the wilderness. Now, we often think of desert where it's empty and devoid of all things. It's not necessarily true as we think of the sandiness of a desert. It is wilderness, meaning a little bit different. There is grass, there is other things. They had a lot of cattle that needed to eat. What they did not have was provision of regular food. And so God then provides manna for the people. That's Exodus 16. He provides water when they need it, Exodus 17. He provides victory over their enemies. And then there is direction and organization of the nation. So a lot of things are coming together. The nation is new, they've moved out, and God's continually providing sustenance for them. So the first thing God did when he brought them out in the wilderness wasn't to give them rules. First, he started by giving them food, and he gave them water, and he gave them victory. He is caring for them as he brings them to the point where he's going to speak to them. And I very much appreciate that God cares for their physical needs before he comes and gives them these 10 words. He makes sure they are taken care of. They have everything they need to focus and listen. If anyone's done any teaching, how effective can your teaching be if your students are hungry? Not very effective. That goes for little kids, or it goes for pastors who preach too long past lunchtime, right? Like once hunger starts, people lose the ability to focus. And it is a challenge. So God took care of their physical needs, their concerns, their worries. They were nervous about how they were going to live and survive. God took care of that before we get to Exodus 19 and 20. But now that he's cared for them, God brings them, Exodus 19, they come out and they camp in the wilderness of Sinai, and specifically before a mountain. And this is where God then calls Moses that he is going to do something. We looked at Exodus 19 back in January. This was the very first passage we studied, so we're not going to go through it all today. But he separated them. He said, don't let them touch the mountain. I'm going to come down. There's going to be thunders and lightning. And they brought the people out in Exodus 19. And the mountain is covered in smoke because God has descended on it in fire. And then we have this point, Exodus 19:19. It says, the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. He called Moses up. And then God said, okay, now that you're up here, go down and warn the people. So you can feel like Moses. God says, come up to the mountain. So Moses climbs the mountain. He gets up there, and God, what's the first thing God tells him to do? Go back down the mountain, right? It's like when my wife's not here, and so you'll have to tell her I talked about her. But sometimes she'll call me to her room. So our room. I'll come to our room. I'll come there, and she's like, can you go get me some water? You could have hollered that to me. It's just like, I came here and I have to go get the water. That's kind of what God said to Moses. Come up. God says, go down and warn the people. So they are all set. The people can't come up. They're not to touch. And don't let the people break through to come to the mountain, lest I break through on them. And that's that idea of the presence of God demanding this separation. So Moses goes down to the people, told them the instructions, the rules, and then we come to Exodus 20, verse 1. God spoke these words, saying, and thus begins the 10 words. And what's really interesting as we begin, I thought about having somebody get up and try to give me the 10 commandments without looking. I decided not to do that. But are you guys aware there's actually different lists of 10 out there? Does anybody know that? So there's generally about 3 different lists of what are the 10 rules, commandments, or words. So if you ask a traditional Jewish person, they will give you one set of 10. And then there is a Lutheran Catholic, Roman Catholic version, and then there's a Protestant version. That's generally speaking. But what's really interesting is if you look at the Jewish version, and I even went and confirmed on some Jewish websites, if you were to ask a general Protestant, if you were to ask me growing up the 10 commandments, where would most of us start the first commandment? Which verse? Verse 3, right? You shall have no other gods before me. If you were to go to the Jewish websites I went to, the first word or the first commandment for them begins in verse 2. So the list that I got from the website, commandment number 1 is, I am the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Commandment 2 is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Commandment 3 is, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. So for their list, 1, and once again, this is partly why they're words and not commandments. 1 is, I'm the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt. 2, thou shalt have no other gods before me, is combined with the don't make yourselves a carved image or a likeness. That is all part of the same idea. Now, I'm not going to tell you one list is wrong or not. Today, we're not going to look at that, but it's very interesting that we often separate the very first thing God said, verse 2, we put it aside and we start at verse 3, right? And partly, why do we do that? Verse 3 has the beginning of what? Restrictions and the rules, right? I've already said we tend to focus on those. And yet, the first thing God spoke is, I am the Lord thy God. And I brought you out of the house of bondage. Now, here is what I expect of you. It's combined in there. We do that so much. And just so you know, it's not just in Exodus. If you have like a piece of paper or something, I told you these are listed again in Deuteronomy 5. I'm going to read there briefly. And in Deuteronomy 5, Moses is recounting all of this for a new generation. And he recaps in the first few verses the setting about God speaking out of the mountain. And you are afraid, verse 5 says, you are afraid because of the fire. You did not go up into the mountain. He said, God said, verse 6, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So it's a word-for-word quote. So Moses is beginning again with the very first word that God says, not with the very first commandment we generally tend to ascribe to this. And so what that suggests is that the God, as he self-proclaims who he is as part of this, it is encouraging that that was part of what Moses was sure to recount, that God was declaring he was their God. There was relationship, there was love, there was a connection with God, which then demanded different living. And that is the beginning of the 10 words. And it's important to see that combined there. Now, what I'm not going to have the time to do today to go through all 10 of the commandments and examine them. That'd be a great study sometime. And I'm going to go through and make some points about them. But if you were hoping for like a detailed description and a study on every single one, you'll have to see me later. We'll have to set up a personal study. We're not going to be able to do that today. But one thing I want to do is if you begin the first word with I am the Lord your God and look at the Jewish list, there are 3 of the commandments or words that start with positive phrases and the rest start with negative phrases. Now, that is 1, I am the Lord thy God. 4, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. And 5, honor thy father and mother. All the rest are negatives. So it has 3 positives and 7 negatives. If you go with the traditional Protestant version, it's 8 negatives and 2 positives. But what's really exciting is if you go with the 3, the Jewish outline of the 10 words, it really divides the commandments into sets of 3. So the first 3 commandments reflect the human relationship with God. So God says, I'm the Lord thy God. You are to have no other gods before me and not take my name in vain. So the first 3 reflect our relationship with God. Number 4, remember the Sabbath, then stands apart and unique as a specific act of worship. And we will talk a little bit about that today, probably not as much as you might like me to. Number 4 is remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. And then 5, honor thy father and mother, another positive, begins the remainder of the list, which all reflects an attitude and a connection to humanity. And as you look at this, we are familiar with these. We know them. You probably, I think, I was confident that most people here could give me all 10. However, how many of you remember the story from the Gospel of Matthew where somebody came up and tried to trick Jesus about the law, the 10 Commandments? Anybody remember what happened? It's in Matthew 22. So they came up, and this is a passage. All of Matthew 22 is a series or connection to a few different groups of people trying to trick Jesus into messing up. And so Matthew 22:23 talks about some Sadducees coming up and trying to trick Jesus about the resurrection. And so that happens. Now, we find out then, verse 34, the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together. So kind of what's going on here in Matthew 22 is a competition of Jesus' enemies to see which of them can mess Jesus up. So the idea is that Jesus is a threat to these organizations, and so they are kind of taking their turns, giving their best shot to mess Jesus up, to show to the crowds that he is not the wonderful, perfect man that they think he is. So the Pharisees, and they are experts in the law, they come up with their trick question. So one of them, a lawyer in my version, asked him a question, an expert in the law, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" Now, if you were to think back, we have the 10 words or the 10 commandments, and then we have a whole lot of laws after that. And here the test comes for that. Now, which of the 10 commandments does Jesus give them? Anybody know? You just shout out a number. What's that? Love the Lord thy God. Which 10 of the 10 commandments is that one? It's not one at all, right? What he quotes for them is from Deuteronomy chapter 6. And Deuteronomy chapter 6 is a very vital passage to the nation of Israel, even to this day. If you go down to the hip strip in Montego Bay, there is a Jewish restaurant run by a rabbi. Has anybody ever been down there? It's called the Kosher Hotspot. It's very interesting. You go in, there's right by the door for tourists who are Jewish who come, there is a phylactery. Does anybody know what a phylactery is? If you ever see a picture of a Jewish person, they have something wrapped around their forehead. And that's what that is. And it comes from the Old Testament where it says, "Bind this as a sign on thy forehead." They actually make something that goes on their forehead. Well, they quote Deuteronomy chapter 6. That is one of the daily quotations that a Jewish person will do. Verse 4 of Deuteronomy 6, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them to your children." It goes down, and verse 8 is where it says, "You will bind them as a sign in your hand. They'll be as frontlets between your eyes." And that's where they actually wrap something around their hand, or they actually wrap something on their forehead. They literally put this on them to focus their ideas. But here, Deuteronomy 6 comes right after Deuteronomy 5. And what did I say happens in Deuteronomy 5? The repeat of the 10 commandments. And after you get the repeat of the 10, we get Deuteronomy 6, which then has this idea: you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. And it's fascinating that what Moses is doing under the direction of the Holy Spirit is taking the content of the 10 commandments and reflecting it into the idea behind the commandments. What this suggests is that when God spoke these commandments, the emphasis wasn't necessarily on the literal restrictions of each commandment, but on the greater truth that they communicated. And that doesn't just happen in Deuteronomy 6 and Matthew 22. If you think back to the early days of Jesus' ministry in Matthew chapter 5, there's a sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. And in that sermon, Jesus himself goes through some of the 10 commandments. And as he does so, he helps people understand that the 10 commandments were not necessarily to be interpreted completely literally. If you're not familiar, I'll just remind you of some. You probably heard it, where Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, you've heard it said, don't commit murder, right? They've heard that. It's from the 10 commandments. For those who have studied Matthew 5, what does Jesus then turn around and do? He says, but if you hate your brother in your heart, you have already committed murder. And or not angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. So he is instructing them. So what's fascinating here is that when we get to the time of Jesus, Jesus who was the perfect expert in the Old Testament law, he knew the guy who wrote it, right? So it's kind of like if somebody writes a document or a law, and to be concise, they condense it into, a simple phrase. Well, if you know that person, you can say, well, what did you mean by that? And they could explain it better. Here we have Jesus, who knows the guy who wrote the 10 Commandments, right? God the Father, explaining the intent behind them. Now, this is very, very important, and this causes problems even in human laws, right? Now, you're well aware that Jamaica is currently looking at rewriting their constitution, right? Now, this was probably going to draw some conflict out into common discussions, and so we need to pray for the country as they go through this. So I'm going to set aside and allow you to look at someone else's document for this illustration. And the country I grew up in, the United States, in their Constitution, they wrote it, and then not everybody was happy with what was in the Constitution. So before it was approved, they had to make some amendments to it, some fixes to it. And I don't know if you're familiar with what's called the Second Amendment. Is anybody familiar with the Second Amendment? We're not going to talk about it, but it refers to guns. We're not going to have a discussion on that at all today. Don't worry. But here's the key. To this day, they argue over what was meant by what they wrote. So there's a document. We can read what they said. The argument persists. Well, what did they mean when they said such and such, right? So what would be nice is what? We could call them up and say, hey, when you said this, did you mean this or this? We're just trying to be clear here. And what's fascinating is when Jesus came to earth, people thought they understood the 10 Commandments. They thought they had figured out the outward reflection of the rules that God was putting into place. And here comes Jesus, who comes along and says, you guys know this rule, right? Not murder? Yeah. We got that down. We're good. If anybody does that, we punish them. Jesus says, well, what I want you to know is you kind of missed the point. And he goes through the adultery commandment. He goes through a couple of them. And he highlights for them that the intent is not just the rule itself, but the goal behind it is to reflect a heart attitude that is more important than following the law. You guys are aware, with human laws, sometimes they get really long, right? And why do they get so long? Well, they get so long because we have to write with so much detail that nobody can find a loophole. You guys heard of loopholes, right? And we as children are excellent at finding loopholes, right? Anyone ever try to find loopholes in the rules your parents gave you? Or are you all excellent children when you were younger? Well, that's good. Praise God for that. Call your mothers up next week and thank them. So we write, it's like, well, don't do this, but that means you can't do this. We have to clarify everything. Well, if you go and study ancient laws, partly due to the fact of handwriting and writing materials were very expensive, they did not write laws like that. They didn't write laws so expansive that try to rule out every single possible interpretation of a thing. Instead, they would write, in some ways, what my study has shown is they would write examples of something. And in the example, they are trying to illustrate the larger idea. And the goal was to help people understand the idea behind it. And that is why you had series of judges or rulers who would help interpret the general law to specific situations. Now, this still happens to this day. That's one of the things judges do. But the goal was that you did not have to write every single possible iteration. So, for example, we have a commandment that says, you shall not murder or you shall not kill. Now, there's some debate over which is the best word used to translate it. And why is that the case? Well, because we as humans have created a few different words for kill, right? And they have different meanings in English. So, who here knows the word manslaughter? All right? So, what's the difference between murder and manslaughter? Accidental or intentional, right? And that's a very broad generalization. But so when we look at the Ten Commandments, which some translations say murder and some say kill, there's a lot of argument about what was actually meant by that. But in reality, what does Jesus say? What was the intent? Don't get angry and act out towards your brother. Like, it's beyond the whole, what, did you accidentally kill them or intentionally kill them? Jesus is saying, that's not the point at all. I don't want you getting close to the killing point. I wanted you to understand that you are to act in such a way to do that. Now, there are further laws that deal with accidental or intentional killing. You guys aware of that? God actually made certain cities where if you accidentally killed somebody, you could go to the city, and as long as you stayed in the city, you would be protected. So we're getting into a lot more detail later on, but the intent with the Ten Commandments when Jesus comes in chapter 5 is not the express, detailed, what exactly it says, but on the principle behind it. I am the Lord your God. And that is why Deuteronomy 6 is God's answer to what is the greatest commandment. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And there's so much power in that one commandment that connects this idea. When we read the word soul, what do you and I think of? We think of the non-physical part of who you and I are, right? We think of this Greek idea of the soul. But the Hebrew word there is one called nephesh. Now, I know you guys don't know what nephesh is, but nephesh is the Hebrew word for neck. Does that surprise you? That the word translated for us, soul, is the word neck. Now, the reason why is what moves through the neck? All that is necessary for the sustenance of life, right? We need water, we need food, we need air. Where does that all enter? The head. Although, sometimes Jude, my 1-year-old, tries to push the food in all sorts of places in his body. I think he thinks it goes in anywhere. It goes through, and it goes through the neck. And throughout the Old Testament, that word neck is actually used to refer to living beings. So when in Genesis, when Abraham went to deliver Lot and all of his family, it says he delivered all of the nepheches, all of the necks, meaning he delivered and saved living people. The neck was the word used for the idea of a living being to process that. So when the Bible often refers to the entirety of an individual, it uses that word neck. And so when it says you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your neck, and with all your might, it's not talking about some non-physical part of us. This is why translation of different languages is so hard, because if we just put neck in there, would that make sense to anybody? It wouldn't. It's so hard, and that's why I don't do translation. It's very difficult. But it's exciting to think that when God was doing that, he was saying every part that involves your living self is to love God and follow after him. That means the words that proceed through your neck, the things that come into you. A lot of laws are going to come later about what you put into you and what you say, and all of that, it consumes this idea. So when Moses is summarizing the 10 commandments with the greatest commandment, it doesn't talk about what you do out of restriction. It says what you do out of what? Love. And then Matthew 22, after God says the greatest commandment, he even gives a bonus answer. They only asked him for one, but he gives them two. What does God say in Matthew 22 after he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul? The second is like it. You will love your neighbor as whom? As yourself. Now, here's the question. Is that in the 10 Commandments? That's not there either, is it? So we don't know where that's from. You're like, well, Matthew, because Jesus said it, right? It actually comes from Leviticus chapter 19. This is how you know Jesus was an excellent student of the Word. So Leviticus is going through all the rules, and we're going to get into more Leviticus, and it talks about the holiness of God, and it talks about, in Leviticus 19:9, it talks about when you reap the harvest of your land, don't go all the way to the edges. Leave some for other people. Don't steal. Don't lie. So there's a lot of things connected to 10 Commandments here. Don't oppress your neighbor or rob him. Don't keep somebody's wages if you owe them money. Don't do injustice in court. Verse 17 even says, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but reason frankly. Verse 18, Leviticus 19, after going through all these different rules about how you act, says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the end of the verse says what? I am the Lord. What is the very first word that God spoke on the mountain? I am your God. See, that sentence, which we drop off the 10 Commandments, underlines and underscores and drives all of the commandments. That is why when Jesus is asked the greatest commandment, he goes to Deuteronomy 6. Your God is one God, love him. And then he goes to Leviticus 19, very obscure chapter, and says, you are to love your neighbor. Why? Because I am the Lord. See, what we realize then is that the commandments are not driven by God requiring certain action, but by the character of God, which requires a certain attitude. Let's make that clear. The commandments aren't God requiring action, behaviors that we have to shape and do to try to look like we are matching something. Instead, it is the character of God demanding an attitude. And both of the ultimate greatest commandments are expressed not just in Matthew 22, but in Deuteronomy and Leviticus as what? Love. The undergirding of the Ten Commandments is not an oppressive set of rules, but an expression of an attitude of love. And unfortunately, the commandments have become this cultural phenomenon that makes them of such utmost importance that we do amazing things with them. You realize that the Ten Commandments, not the Jewish version, but the Protestant version, are like plastered up. Have you ever seen them on walls or monuments? There's even a place, I think it is in Germany, where they are put on a hillside. Don't quote me on that. I know they're on a hillside somewhere. Someone took a side of a hill and put them with rocks, the Ten Commandments up there. And if you go there, it does not begin with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out. It starts with, thou shalt not, right? And it's fascinating for me that we do that today. The Pharisees focus on the rules in the time of Jesus. And clearly, by the time we get to the book of Deuteronomy, the temptation to make the commandments something of that nature was already there, because Moses follows up his talking about the Ten Commandments with Deuteronomy 6, which gives us the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your neck, and your might. What does that suggest for you and me? Well, what it suggests, first of all, is that you and I are prone to want to order our lives by predictability and simplicity. Now, what that means is we like things to be as clear and as precise as possible. All right? We want clarity. So if someone comes to you and starts telling you, or they call you up and they say, I need to talk to you about something. Okay. Well, I don't know if you remember, like 5 years ago, and they start telling the story, and we want, okay, what are we talking about? Let's get to the point. Well, we do it also with, I talk to my children, and they're leaving with charity sometime, and I just say, obey your mother, right? Well, they know then I've covered all the bases. If she says something, you're to do it. Am I telling them that if she doesn't tell them, they can do whatever they want? No, what I'm telling them is all of your actions should be focused on honoring your mother. But I generalize it to obey your mother, right? Well, then we come out later that, they were hitting each other. Well, she didn't say don't hit each other until after we started. Okay. The point was, so then we have to add more information. Anyone here ever have to add information for children as they push the boundaries? Ever had to add information for adults that you know? We all do that. We crave. And so even in our hearts and our culture, we have made the Ten Commandments, in our understanding, a list of do's and do nots. And in both cases where it's presented, it begins with, I am the Lord who delivered you. The deliverance, the salvation of God is what allows God to stand there and communicate his words to his people, who he loves and who he cares about. And yet, we see it as a list of rules. And by so doing, as we, over and over again, as we look at the law, we are neglecting the fact that this is a God who loves and cares for his people. The 10 rules don't come when Moses first shows up, right? Here's how it could have gone. Moses in the wilderness, he sees a bush on fire. He goes to the bush, and God says, Moses. Moses is like, oh, who are you? Well, I'm God, but here's what's really important, Moses. I need you to go to the people and give them some rules to follow. Then they'll please me, and I can take care of them. Is that how it went down? No. God looked at Moses and said, Moses, I've heard my people, and I see them. Go and deliver them. Moses is like, well, how do they know it's you? Well, tell them my name, I am, has sent you. Doesn't give them rules to follow. He gives them a person. And Moses goes and he reaches out and he delivers them through the power of God, and he walks them out and delivers them through the Red Sea, and he carries them out into the wilderness, and he gives them food, he gives them water, he gives them deliverance and victory. Then he brings them to a mountain. God comes down with his own presence onto the mountain, and he starts with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. The thing is, that commandment is almost totally unnecessary. Because what? The story of God's love and power has been demonstrated for 19 chapters of Exodus, that those people should have no question that there is no reason, there is no need, and there should be no desire to have any God before the one who is in front of them, and thunder and lightning on a mountain, who delivered them from the most powerful nation on earth and gave them food where there was no food. And now he's saying, have no other God before me. That's not an oppressive rule. That's a logical outcome of being overwhelmed by the grace and love of an all-powerful God who cares about you personally and wants to have a relationship with you. That's not an oppressive rule. That's an amazing comfort and love that I need nothing else but this God who cares for me and has delivered me from the worst possible outcome that I would choose. The commandments are not God's restriction, but God's calling and deliverance and love that he has for his people. We have to stop seeing the Bible as this dichotomy of the demands of God against the love of God. They all combine into one amazing story of what God has done for us. As we finish, I want to finish in a place you might not expect, in the book of Hebrews. And in the book of Hebrews, let me move that closer. In Hebrews chapter 12, near the end of the book, the author of Hebrews is coming, and he comes and he reflects back to the mountain of Sinai. He comes back and focuses their attention on what happened. And he describes it for the people in such a way that they have reflected and remembered this event as an oppressive one. It says there in Hebrews 12:18, you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken of them. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches a mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. The author is saying, remember that time when you guys couldn't even bear the words of God? But that's not the point. The point is this, verse 22, you have come to Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, innumerable angels in festival gathering, to the assemblies of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. What the author of Hebrews is doing is says, remember where you read about the darkness and the fire and the power and the fear? That wasn't the point anyway, but here's what we have now. And he lists the wonderful blessings and the overwhelming power of Jesus being the new covenant. And the new covenant, which I didn't have time, I ran out of time. Jeremiah 31, read that, where God even says, I will write my law on their hearts, not on tablets of stone. And so when we mention here in Hebrews 12 all the wonderful things we have because of the blood of Jesus Christ, we get verse 25. See that you not refuse him who is speaking. If you just jump in on that verse, what does it do? It sounds oppressive and sounds like God saying, don't refuse me when I'm speaking to you. If you just peek in at a family when a parent's mad at a kid and you just see that action, you don't see the love that might surround it. And if you just look at verse 25, don't refuse him who is speaking. But the author just said, here's who's speaking. Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word. That's what's speaking. The grace of the blood of Jesus Christ. The blood that we are going to celebrate in a few minutes by thinking of that it was given out of sacrifice and death. That's what's speaking. Don't separate the demand for righteous living from the deliverance of a righteous God. The power of the law, and specifically of the Ten Commandments, are not to give us a thing to live by. There's even, I think Pastor and I have talked about it, there's a way to share the gospel which specifically talks about the Ten Commandments. I forget the name of it, but it's like, do you keep the Ten Commandments? No, well, you're going to die and go to hell. Now, there's nothing wrong with that because it is true. The Ten Commandments do highlight and show the ways in which we do not meet up to the demands and holiness of a God. That is why you and I, on our own, ultimately would be like the people of Israel touching the mountain. If we were to try to enter the presence of God on our own, we would suffer death for all eternity. But the God on the mountain delivering the Ten Commandments is not a God who desires his people to die. That's why before he gave the rules, he did everything else to set it up so the people would be safe, could hear him speak, and ultimately hear a message that he intended to be one of love from himself, asking for love from his people. That is what the excellence of the law calls us. So whether the Ten Commandments apply to you and I today or not, we will cover in another sermon, so stay tuned. But what I want you to remember today as you leave is that the first word God spoke verbally to the people is, I am the Lord the God who delivered you. It is that same God who speaks to you and I today, daily, as you open the Word of God, which I encourage you to do. What he is saying is not, do this, do this, do this to live a life that pleases me. What he is saying is, I am the Lord your God who delivered you. Why would you live any other way than completely and fully for me? So Exodus 20 reminds us that the God who demands our life is not a God who wishes us to suffer, but a God who desires to be with us, to share with us, and will deliver us from everything, including death, so that we can be with him. That is the God who calls us to live in love for him and love for the world. That is the essence of the 10 Commandments, or the 10 words. Let's pray.